You know that feeling when you're looking at something beautiful, a piece of art, or a family heirloom, and a tiny, almost invisible crack catches your eye once you see it. You can't unsee it, and you realize the whole thing is more fragile than you ever imagined. For 15 years, that was my marriage to Dr. Edward Monroe. He was the brilliant professor, the charismatic star of every social gathering, while I was his quiet wife, the book restorer who patiently mended the forgotten stories of others. I believed our life together was a priceless first edition, perfectly preserved and bound in trust. But then I discovered he hadn't just torn out a page, he'd written a secret sequel with someone else. And that's when I decided to orchestrate an ending he could never have predicted. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Caroline, and for 15 years, my world was a quiet sanctuary of aged paper and faded ink, a stark contrast to the vibrant performative life of my husband, Dr. Edward Monroe. While he commanded lecture halls with booming analyses of tragic heroines, I spent my days patiently mending the spines of forgotten stories, believing ours was a first edition bound in genuine leather. I found a deep methodical peace in my work as a rare book restorer for the city's oldest museum, a satisfaction in taking something broken and making it whole again. I truly believed my life was a reflection of my work, carefully preserved, historically significant, and authentic to its core. Our life in Philadelphia was, by all accounts, perfect. We were the intellectual power couple of the university circle, he, the charismatic literature professor who could make Victorian tragedies feel urgent and vital, and I, the quiet, respected archivist who kept the past alive. Our evenings were a curated collection of dinner parties, where his colleagues would debate postmodern theory. Weekends were spent browsing dusty bookshops, and our night settled into the shared, comfortable silence of two people who presumably had nothing left to hide. I mistook that silence for peace, for the effortless understanding that comes after more than a decade of shared history. I should have known something was wrong when Edward, a man who had built his career on deconstructing the classics, suddenly developed an interest in the fleeting world of contemporary art. For years, he dismissed it as shallow and performative, but suddenly he was attending gallery openings and speaking with newfound authority on abstract expressionism. He started wearing tailored tweed jackets that were a shade too fashionable for a tenured professor, and bought a ridiculously expensive leather satchel he claimed was a necessary upgrade for his image at academic conferences. When I asked about his new hobby, he simply smiled and said he was broadening his intellectual horizons. The red flags began to accumulate like unread books on a nightstand. There were late-night faculty meetings at upscale bistros I'd never heard of, weekend research trips to the city's arts district that never resulted in any new lecture material, and a sudden obsession with a philosopher who wrote about the importance of living your authentic truth. Nothing signals a midlife crisis quite like a 45-year-old academic discovering authenticity through what I was beginning to suspect was adultery. But I am not just any wife. My entire professional life is dedicated to spotting inconsistencies, to recognizing the subtle signs of a forgery, and to patiently uncovering the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. When Edward's behavior shifted from odd to outright suspicious, I didn't reach for a wine glass and cry. I went to my workshop at the museum, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and leather, and I began my research. The first clue was mundane, almost insultingly so. I was mending the pocket of his favorite winter tweed coat, the one he'd been wearing to all his new gallery events, when my fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of paper. It was a receipt from a boutique wine shop in a neighborhood we never visited, dated on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks prior. The charge was for a $400 bottle of vintage Bordeaux, the very same bottle he had presented to me that evening, claiming it was a celebratory gift from his department for a recently published paper. The lie was so small, so specific, and it felt like a deliberate tear in the fabric of our life. A department gift would have been logged, accounted for. This was a private purchase, made in a part of town he had no reason to be in. On an afternoon, he was supposed to be in an ethics committee meeting. The world didn't spin off its axis. Instead, a chilling, silent clarity descended upon me. My mind, trained to analyze watermarks and chain lines in ancient paper, immediately saw the lie for what it was, a deliberate corruption of our shared history. My desire wasn't for a screaming match. What I craved was the cold, hard, undeniable truth, assembled piece by piece with the same meticulous precision I used to restore a 17th century atlas. I began my real work that night, not as a wounded wife, but as a historian piecing together the narrative of a great betrayal. I cross referenced our credit card statements with his calendar, and the inconsistencies piled up. Lunches at expensive restaurants categorized as departmental expenses, charges from high end gift shops near the arts district. It was almost too easy. A sloppy forgery that any amateur could spot. The breakthrough, however, came from the most modern of sources, a tagged photo on a junior colleague's Instagram feed. It was from a gallery opening 2 weeks prior, an event Edward had claimed was a tedious networking obligation. There, in the background of a blurry photo, he was captured in what was clearly an intimate conversation with a striking brunette, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. A few clicks were all it took. I traced the tag to the gallery's own social media page, and there she was, featured in a professional headshot. Her name was Sophia Russo, the gallery's ambitious and highly regarded director. Her online biography was a masterpiece of pretentious prose, filled with phrases about curating visceral experiences and interrogating the dialectic between artist and observer. Her professional photo was perfectly styled, radiating the kind of cool, intellectual confidence that suggested she considered other people's marriages to be quaint, outdated institutions. A subsequent search revealed the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Sophia Russo was married to Liam O'Connell, the celebrated chef and owner of Aperture, Philadelphia's most sought-after new restaurant. Seeing their names linked together felt like aligning two fragments of a torn manuscript to reveal a hidden, ugly message. Poor Liam. His social media was a shrine to his wife, filled with candid photos of their life together, anniversary posts that were painfully sincere, and comments on her posts filled with heart emojis and inside jokes. He was clearly a man deeply in love, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife's idea of curating experiences now included curating an affair with my husband. At that moment, a direct confrontation felt too clumsy, too predictable for a man like Edward, who critiques tragedies for a living. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a dramatic scene he could later analyze and dismiss as female hysteria. Instead, I decided to write a new final chapter myself. My plan began to form with the quiet intensity of a chemical reaction. I wouldn't just expose them, I would do it on a stage of my own creation, using the tools and the identity they had both so profoundly underestimated. I spent the next week in the museum's archives, crafting the perfect proposal on official letterhead. I outlined a potential partnership between the museum and Aperture for a series of historical dining events, a concept just plausible enough to pique the interest of a serious, community-minded restaurateur like Liam O'Connell. I studied his restaurant's online presence, noting his passion for local history and his innovative approach to cuisine, tailoring my pitch to his known interests. I requested a preliminary meeting to discuss the project, suggesting lunch at his restaurant the following Thursday at 1 o'clock. It was a calculated move. I knew from Edward's credit card statements that their little trysts always happened on Thursdays, around lunchtime, by inviting Liam to his own restaurant at that specific time. I was simply arranging for the right people to be in the right place at the right time. The truth was going to emerge eventually. I was just giving it a little scheduling assistance. Liam responded to my email within hours, his tone professional, enthusiastic, and heartbreakingly innocent. He loved the idea and said the time was perfect. Meanwhile, at home, Edward was giving an award-worthy performance as the devoted husband. He'd started this new habit of kissing my forehead before he left for work, a small, patronizing gesture of fake affection designed to absolve him of his sins. The night before our scheduled family reunion, he came home with a story that almost made me choke on my tea. He'd just come from a fascinating guest lecture at a local art gallery. He said, his eyes lit up with a fraudulent intellectual passion. He went on to describe, in detail, how the gallery director had given him a private tour, explaining the artist's use of light and shadow. He was essentially telling me about his date with Sophia while disguising it as a work story. The audacity of it was breathtaking. But I played along, asking thoughtful questions about the artist's technique. "She sounds brilliant," I said, my voice even. "Maybe we should hire her to consult on the art for our living room." Edward nearly dropped his briefcase. "Oh, no, I don't think so." He stammered. "She's probably incredibly expensive. And besides, our house is fine just the way it is." The real twisted part was that part of me was almost impressed. He was putting more effort into hiding his affair than he'd put into our actual marriage in years. That same evening, he brought me flowers, a cheap, gas station bouquet of carnations that screamed guilt purchase. As I arranged the pathetic flowers in a vase, I smiled back at him, a calm, serene expression he mistook for affection. All while I pictured him trying to explain that same smile to his lover over their final meal together. The morning of the performance, I spent an hour getting ready. I didn't choose a revenge dress. I chose my armor, a tailored navy blazer, a crisp white blouse, and heels that made me feel grounded and powerful. It was the kind of outfit that said successful professional, not scorned wife. As I drove downtown, I felt a strange sense of calm. For weeks, I had been a passive observer of my own life's destruction. Today, I was the director. I had reserved a parking spot across the street, and as I walked towards the restaurant, I saw Edward's car parked discreetly behind a row of hedges. Amateur. Walking into Aperture felt like stepping onto a stage I had designed myself. The restaurant was buzzing with the lunchtime rush, the air filled with the scent of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. Liam O'Connell was exactly as his reputation suggested, focused, intense, and genuinely gracious as he led me to a quiet table. We began discussing the historical menus I had proposed, and he was completely engaged, sketching ideas on a napkin. His passion for his work obvious and infectious. He was a good man. And for a moment, I almost felt guilty for what I was about to do. Almost. I look at the restored book in my hands, its pages now secure, its story whole again. Then I look around my sunlit, silent workshop, a space that is entirely my own. I realize now that the betrayal didn't destroy my story. It simply forced me to see that I had been lovingly, painstakingly preserving a brilliant forgery. The greatest restoration project of my life wasn't some forgotten text, but myself, and her story was just beginning. We were deep in a conversation about colonial-era cooking techniques when, through the bustling room, I saw them enter. Edward and Sophia glided to a secluded corner booth with the comfortable familiarity of a weekly ritual. They were laughing, their heads close together, a perfect picture of intimacy. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice remained steady as I continued my conversation with Liam, waiting for the perfect moment. I let a few minutes pass, letting them order their drinks and settle in, their little bubble of secrecy still intact. Then, I paused mid-sentence, feigning a sudden realization as I looked towards their table. "Liam, forgive me for interrupting," I said, my tone light and conversational. "But isn't that your wife over there?" What a wonderful coincidence. His head turned, his friendly expression slowly freezing as he registered the scene. Sophia was touching Edward's hand across the table. Her smile meant only for him. Before Liam could wave or call out her name, I placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Before you go over there," I said softly, "there's something you need to know." He looked at me, his eyes clouded with confusion. "The man your wife is having lunch with," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, "that's Doctor. Edward Monroe, my husband. The color drained from Liam's face as the pieces clicked into place. His eyes darted between me and the booth, where his wife and my husband were now sharing a private joke, completely oblivious. "What are you saying?" "They're having an affair," he whispered, his voice cracking. I simply nodded. "For months, every Thursday, this exact booth." I watched him process the information. The look on his face, one I recognized all too well. It was the look of a person watching their entire reality crumble in real time. He finally looked at me, a flicker of something new in his eyes. "You planned this, didn't you?" "I simply arranged for the right people to be in the right place at the right time," I replied. "And now, I believe it's time for some introductions." As we walked across the restaurant, it felt like the longest 20 feet of my life. Every step brought us closer to the moment that would shatter 4 lives. Edward saw me first. The expression on his face was a symphony of panic and disbelief. His mouth dropped open, and his face turned a shade of red that clashed horribly with his expensive jacket. Sophia turned to see what had caused his sudden paralysis, and when her eyes met mine, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. But the real magic happened when she saw Liam standing beside me. "Well, well," I said, my voice dripping with fake sweetness as I slid into their booth uninvited. "What a delightful coincidence running into you two here." Liam remained standing, towering over the table like a handsome storm cloud. "Edward," I continued, "I'd like you to meet Liam O'Connell. Liam, this is my husband, Edward." Edward managed a weak, sweaty handshake. "And Sophia," I said, turning to the woman who had been redecorating my marriage, "I believe you already know your husband." The silence that followed was absolute. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Sophia found her voice first, though it was 3 octaves higher than normal. "Liam, what? What are you doing here?" He replied with chilling calmness. "Having a business lunch with Caroline. We were discussing a project for the museum." The irony was beautiful. The woman who had been using business meetings as a cover for her affair was now watching her husband do the same. "Caroline, what are you doing here?" Edward finally managed to say. Possibly the stupidest question in the history of stupid questions. "I'm having lunch with Liam," I repeated slowly. "The more interesting question, Edward, is what are you doing here? I thought you had a faculty meeting this afternoon." This is a client meeting," Sophia stammered, looking desperately at Edward for support. "Oh, a client meeting," I said, savoring the words. "I'm fascinated. Please, explain to me, and to your husband, what kind of professional services you've been providing to my husband every Thursday for the past few months." Liam, who had been remarkably quiet, finally spoke. "Actually, Sophia, I am curious," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Especially since you told me you were working with a new client on a very demanding project, a master bedroom renovation, I believe you called it." The master bedroom comment hit like a physical blow. Edward actually choked on his water. I could see them both searching for an exit, a lie, any way out. But there was none. I had built the perfect trap. The dam finally burst, and the truth came flooding out in a pathetic mess of denials and half-baked explanations. It wasn't what we thought. They insisted. It was exactly what we thought. Finally, Liam sat down heavily, the weight of it all crashing down on him. "Just tell me how long," he asked quietly, when neither of them answered. I did. "It started with a professional consultation months ago and evolved into this." The restaurant had grown noticeably quiet around us. Our little drama was apparently more entertaining than the daily specials. "Perhaps we should take this somewhere more private," Edward suggested, finally aware of their audience. "Oh, no," I said firmly. "I think this is the perfect place. This is where you chose to build your little secret world. It seems only fitting that it should end here, too." Liam stood up abruptly. "I need some air." he announced, and walked away from the table without another word. I watched him go, feeling a pang of genuine sympathy. But my sympathy didn't extend to the two people still sitting across from me. Congratulations, I told them. You've officially destroyed 2 marriages in the span of one lunch. I stood up, smoothing my skirt and picking up my purse with a dignity I didn't feel but had practiced for days. Enjoy your meal, I said, looking down at them. I hope it was worth it. And with that, I walked away, leaving my cheating husband and his mistress to deal with the wreckage of their choices, the stares of an entire restaurant, and a check for a meal they would never forget, outside. I found Liam leaning against the brick wall. You orchestrated this entire thing just to expose them publicly, he said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. I just looked at him. They made their choices publicly. Every Thursday in that restaurant, I just made sure everyone knew what they were really seeing. The aftermath played out with the predictable messiness of a badly written drama. Edward moved out 3 days later, unable to face me. He rented a sterile, soulless apartment downtown, a fitting home for a man who had hollowed out his own marriage. Our divorce was finalized 6 months later, and thanks to the mountain of evidence I had collected, the negotiations were swift and decidedly in my favor. It turns out the judges take a rather dim view of literature professors who spend marital assets on vintage wine for their mistresses. Who knew? Sophia, I heard, left town 2 weeks after our restaurant encounter. She couldn't handle living in a city where her professional reputation had been so publicly incinerated. Edward tried calling me several times, his messages oscillating between pathetic apologies and indignant accusations that I had humiliated him unnecessarily. I saved his final voicemail, a masterpiece of self-pity in which he called my actions cruel and calculated. Sometimes, when I need a good laugh, I play it back and marvel at the mental gymnastics required for a man to make himself the victim of his own affair. But this story isn't really about them. It's about what happened next. A few weeks after that fateful lunch, Liam called. He didn't call to yell or blame me. He called to thank me. Apparently, the affair was just one symptom of a deeply toxic marriage. He and I started meeting for coffee, initially as a support system for two people navigating the same shipwreck. We talked about lawyers and dividing assets. But soon we were talking about our work, our passions, the people we were before we became the betrayed spouses. I learned that he was even more brilliant and passionate than his reputation suggested. He learned that I was more than just a quiet woman who fixed old books. It's been a year now. I'm sitting in my workshop, the afternoon sun streaming through the large windows, meticulously restoring the gold leaf on a rare first edition of the Scarlet Letter. My phone buzzes. It's a text from Liam, showing me a picture of a new dish he created, inspired by a colonial-era recipe we discussed. Our friendship is a quiet, respectful thing, a structure we built together from the rubble. It's not a rebound or a romance, but an alliance. He helped me remember that my voice was worth hearing, and I helped him see that his vision was worth fighting for. Edward, I heard, moved to another university, chasing a fresh start. I genuinely hope he finds it.